and welcome back to another episode of the Northern Roses podcast. Today it's me, Henry North, a freelance journalist from Manchester, and I'm sat alongside Dr. Adam North.
Hi everyone.
Do you want to quickly introduce what your doctorate is in again?
Yep, so I got my PhD in religions and theology, and I was looking into the issue of structural racism and how elite athletes like Colin Kaepernick utilise gestures to bring our attention to these gestures, and whether as audiences we truly understand or seek to understand further what is being demonstrated through these actions.
Okay, and in today's episode we wanted to kind of explore the topic of racism a little bit further.
Yeah, so I think the idea behind this kind of came out from, and I think you can read about this in the latest article on the Northern Rose, where we're talking about weaponised wokeness.
Yeah.
Is I think there's a kind of a deep lack of understanding, or maybe that's the wrong way of phrasing it, but that I think when people think of racism, they think if I'm not going out insulting, saying discriminatory words towards people of colour, or I'm not being violent towards people of colour, and they'll say, I treat everyone the same way, then I can't be racist. And I think that this is something that is kind of deeply misleading in creating problems when we think about how we actually change society for the better. And so I wanted today to kind of talk about that and try and unpack why I think racism is one of the most important issues that still hasn't been tackled, but if it were to be tackled head on, could help us change society and change the world.
So that weaponised wokeness article was from the 12th of May. So if anyone's interested in reading that, that's where to find it, under the opinions section. So from someone who's not got the expertise in this area, would you consider what you've just said there to kind of be like a kind of passive and active distinction, or is that like barking up?
Yeah, that's right. So there's this idea of like personal, direct racism, which is now largely maligned and seen as, we would all see it as morally wrong. Most people would see it as morally wrong to be racist, to say something racist, to use racist language, or to discriminate against someone based on the colour of their skin, or, and this is something again...
Like segregation.
Yeah. And against something that is often not thought about. It's not just the colour of your skin, but also things like ethnic background or religious identity. They can be races. And there's a really good story that helps, or a really good real life example that helps to illustrate this. So being Jewish is a race, and people don't think being Jewish is a race, or Judaism is not a race. But Nazi Germany, they didn't care about how you looked. They just cared if you were a Jew or not. And so they would kill you even if you said you weren't a Jew. But as long as you were born a Jew, you were to be exterminated. And so being Jewish is not a choice like it could be, I'm a Manchester City fan. Being Jewish is part of your ethnic identity that can mean that you face discrimination. Just as the Nazis would kill you even if you didn't actively identify as a Jew.
I see. So when we're talking about ethnic groups, there's Celtic kind of ethnic groups, I suppose, and maybe Anglo-Saxon here.
Yeah. It's really good. I think it's a really good question. I've jumped ahead of you, but so like being Irish would have once made you privy to racism. Yeah. So the English monarchs would have racially discriminated against Irish people. And so they created the conditions for a famine in Ireland to kill Irish people so that they could take the land. Similarly, Italian people, being Italian was a race in America, and Italians were discriminated against, but then they became...
Anti-Italian discrimination.
Yeah, exactly. But then they became assimilated into whiteness, just like Irish people have. So Irish people are not likely to ever say they are racially discriminated against. Now, although people can make jokes, anti-Irish jokes or anti-Italian jokes, they don't face the same kind of racial discrimination that they once would have done.
So, like we're talking about before, the world was maybe as globalised as it is today. So, for example, you would have had like people in Eastern European looking just a little bit different to how they would, for example, in Western Europe? Would that be considered like different ethnic
Well,
groups?
I think the world's been globalized for so long, but it's more the case of people have always separated other people
Yeah.
through whatever distinctions that make their race superior or better. And so Jewish people and Gypsy Romana people
Yeah.
have, within Europe, been discriminated against for living memory, because they are perceived as basically having incorrect or wrong culture or wrong race. And this is, I think, what makes Jewish people and gypsies especially overlooked in terms of racism, is that they are, because they're white, in many cases, they're not seen as being exposed to racism. But when you think about a lot of racism or stereotypes about Jewish people, what are they described as? Sneaky, puppet masters, operating behind the scenes, because white nationalists, white supremacists are most fearful of Jews because they can't actually identify them, because they're white in many cases. So what you have is they see it as almost an infiltration of whiteness. And the same with gypsies. If you didn't know somebody was a gypsy, just from looking at them, in many cases it would be incredibly hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell if someone's Jewish.
Well, then you get these stereotypes of big noses or other certain, and there are certain identifiers, like they might be wearing a kippah or certain. So there are identifiers, there are stereotypes that are used to try and say you can identify, but there are so many, especially in say like the movie industry, so many Jewish people who nobody would know they were Jewish until somebody said, "Oh, this person's Jewish." I had no idea. But that creates the conditions where, for white supremacists and for people who have racial hatred against Jewish people, they hate them even more than people of colour, because they see them as an enemy from within. And this is like the idea of the great replacement theory, that we're being replaced by this kind of unidentifiable evil force.
Yeah, when I was studying in York, I heard a story, because in York there's like this old keep or something like that on a hill. And I heard that a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment came from that they used to loan people money, because loaning was like illegal or something, but the Jewish people did it anyway. But what that led to was a lot of other people being in debt to the Jewish people, so they thought instead of paying the debts back, they'll just kill them. So yeah, that was part of York's history. They ran them into the keep,
and the thing is, so this is one of the most prevalent racial stereotypes against Jewish people, is that they control the world economy, or that they control money, which is not true. Like the Jewish population the global population is incredibly small. Although they may have significant financial assets, it's still incredibly small compared to, say, white Christians. But what happens is Jewish communities are always persecuted. Like you said, their money will, a Christian feudal lord might say, I'm not paying this Jew, I don't have to. And then they will come up with some reason why they didn't have to, like they were eating the children or whatever kind of myth they propagated. And so Jewish communities had to gather together and pool resources throughout history. This is why there are large collections of Jewish communities. They stick together, otherwise they are fearful for their lives, as history has shown. I think they're smart to do, but that having pooled resources gives them access to issue loans, or to do things that as an individual we're normally incapable of. Like I wouldn't be able to issue a mortgage to someone, but if I were a collection of 300 people, I would be able to offer a mortgage.
Yeah. So to bring that back to, we went off a bit of a tangent there, but I think it's interesting stuff there. So yeah, you wanted to talk about kind of how, even though, to bring it back, it's just a distinction that I've made myself here, and so this kind of active racism, for an individual to go out and prejudice against someone else by calling them a name or through segregation, that's, you'd like to think...
It's explicit.
Explicit, yeah, that's a good way of putting it, yeah. And that's not as... I mean, it still happens, but I'd say on the whole, as a society, it's looked down upon.
Yeah.
And punished, really. Well, in some cases it's not.
It is punished. Like, say you go to a football game, there are clear, anti-racism, no shouting, discriminatory language. There are legal systems in place, and there are no parts of the UK where I think you could get away, obviously people will do it, but it's not seen as acceptable.
So then you wanted to talk about another form.
Yeah, because so to go back to the kind of the football example, you cannot make monkey chants at black players. That is just wrong. You will be kicked out. You'll hopefully receive some kind of legal penalty. However, this doesn't prevent people from using certain coded racial language. For instance, black players are targeted more as being lazy than white players. White players are called intelligent way more than black players. These are like stereotypes or coded language for targeting people of different races with criticism. And we find this throughout how oftentimes I think many of us have these kind of ways of talking about things that we might not be aware of. For instance, if you've ever said that this area or place is a no-go zone, that is coded language, racially coded language. People might say Moss Side is a no-go zone. What do they really mean by that? This area has a high proportion of people of colour, so white people shouldn't go there. And they might associate that with crime or deprivation and other things like that, which might happen in these areas because they are deprived, because they lack the same kind of resources that other areas get. But this coded language is really persistent and prevalent in how people talk about things. And this is the thing, is that racism is kind of underground in that, we all think we're good people. A lot of time we don't use explicitly racist language, but we might use undercover ways of describing areas like, oh, that's a rough area, or I wouldn't want to live there, or however else you might talk about areas where there are a high proportion of people of colour. And what I think this leads to a situation effectively where we come to have racialised behaviours and beliefs without consciously reflecting on them. And this has broader societal problems.
So just to unpack that a little bit is, for example, if there was an area of a city that was particularly crime intense, and I was to call that rough, would you then consider that to be racial language?
Well, what happens is, when you think about areas where crime normally is higher, crime rates are normally higher, they are deprived areas. Which groups in society are the most deprived? They are marginalised and minoritised groups, typically people of colour, black and brown people. So what happens is, these groups who have less resources are often ignored by their local government or their council. These areas have higher crime because people often have no other choice. Or those areas are targeted by drug dealers or people who want to commit crime. Exactly, yeah, they're targeted areas as well by people who are committing crimes, and then they are described as rough. And I think what this description does is it prevents people thinking, how can we improve this? What's gone wrong? We use a descriptor and we go, oh, that's just the way it is there.
So you feel like it condemns?
It does, it condemns, I think. And I think what we should be saying is, rather than saying this area's rough, or I'd never live there, or that's a no-go zone, we need to ask, why is that the case? And actually, isn't that incredibly unfair to the people that live there just to say, that's what it's like, rather than going, what are the circumstances and situation that lead to this happening?
But I just think there are occasionally some places where you kind of wouldn't want to be. But yeah, it's an interesting concept.
Well, yeah, there's a difference between some areas. I think you would of course want to stay safe in them, because if you think, these areas are very deprived and the crime rate's high. But I think rather than us saying these areas are rough, or these, because in many ways I think that takes away the empathy and sympathy for the people that live there, because there'll be loads of, say, women, kids and men who are not involved in this crime but have no choice but to live in these areas because they are affordable to them. Like, if you live in a area that is considered no-go or rough, the housing prices will be low. You will be able to afford to live there. You will be unable to afford to live elsewhere. So you are trapped in that space. I think we need to think about this in empathetic, sympathetic ways.
So your problem is more with the language?
Yeah, language is always underestimated for the effect it has on how we think about the world.
And the connotations, really.
Yeah, and the connotations. And this takes us to the broader point, is that this language and the way we think about race and the way that we stereotype prevents a kind of solidarity. Maybe solidarity, people don't always like that word, but a kind of partnership or cooperation or community spirit that is seriously lacking in this country. And so when Keir Starmer talks about an island of strangers, obviously, again, coded, because who's he talking about as the strangers, coded racism, which is why people have drawn comparisons there. But he's not wrong to say we have forgotten ideas of community and working together. That is what is really lacking. Because how do we drive for change? We have to work together. But how many of us are actually prepared to go and protest with other people? How many of us are prepared to join a picket line if a colleague is fired? I'm not sure how many of us are prepared to do things like that. And it's hard to, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think this is a problem with this kind of language, is that we can see throughout history examples of, even in, say, like the 80s with the miners' strikes, many workers' unions wouldn't allow people of colour to join them or women to join them. And how can that help your movement if you are cutting out a big section of your community? People of colour are overwhelmingly workers within this country. Very few people of colour own a significant proportion of assets. They are workers. And if you are not including them in your movement for whatever reason or idea of them that you might have, you're just decreasing your own potential power.
So to link this back to how the passive side of racism, how does that all link back in? So for example, like, you're just a normal person, really, who goes about their everyday life. Mm-hmm. What kind of ways do you think that they could potentially have racist aspects to them?
Well, this plays into the other, like, if you have the thought about yourself that you're not racist, like, good, you think that. And actually I'd say that's good, that you don't want to be racist to people. You want to be fair, you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, you want to treat people the same. But it's important to recognise that you don't. Like, I don't treat you the same way I would treat another friend. I don't treat anyone the same way. Everyone I treat differently based on who they are. Of course, that's the way.
Relevant to the situation.
Relevant to the context, relevant to my history with them, relevant to what their characteristics are.
How are you feeling on
how
the day?
I'm feeling, what I've eaten, the weather. These factors all play into me treating people differently. So I need to recognise that I am not treating everyone the same way. I'm treating some people differently. And if I am just to say, well, I treat all these people the same and I'm not racist, I hand over my responsibility. I say, well, nothing to do with me. But actually it's everything to do with me. Everything to do with us, because if your primary form of income is work, you are working class. If you own one or two assets, or you own some assets so that if you were to be fired, you could survive for, say, a few years off your savings potentially, or less than a few years, but you could survive, you're maybe middle class. Upper class own many assets. Their primary form of income is passive. They could sit on their arse all day and they'll earn enough to actually thrive.
So how are the main ways that they do that through rents?
Renters, yeah. So they own property and they collect their rents, like feudal lords, they collect their rents. Or capital gains, so they own businesses and they earn money through dividends on those businesses. Or various other forms of owning assets that acquire value over time. So it could be art, it could be gold, it could be other forms of assets as well. But the important thing to recognise is we are all workers here. Many of us, no, I don't think anyone listening to this is not going to be a worker. So if you are a worker, you need to recognise that we are all in the same boat. And what do we really want? We want improved working conditions so we don't all feel miserable at work or feel disaffected and feel like we're doing a bullshit job. We want to feel like work has some meaning and also that the conditions are good. But we also want to feel like there's a safety net and the world's fair and we can get good, easy access healthcare and public transport. And these kind of things is what every person wants. I think every person wants that within the working class. And that doesn't matter if you're a person of colour or not, or it doesn't matter where you're coming at it from. We all want these same things. So why are we not working together to achieve these shared goals? And I think the reason we're not working together is because of racism. And to some extent classism, but primarily the racism works to split the people who have the shared interests apart from one another. And this has happened for centuries. And as I mentioned that example before in the trade unions, is that if you refuse to work with people from other races, you've already lost.
And that would be because it's seen as elitist within itself, or is it, which is what people would need to protest about, so it undermines themselves, does it? Is that kind of the argument there?
Well, in the exclusionary nature is because in many cases people have formed views of others that have been given to them by the media. And who owns the media? It's the rentiers. It's the people who live off passive income. And they give us the idea that people of colour are, say, Islamophobia. They are bringing a religion that is incompatible with British values, and I say that in quotation marks. This is untrue. It's clearly untrue. There are so many people, Islamic people in the UK who get on and they have the same dreams, the same hopes, and they are completely immersed in British life. It's home for them. But this idea that these incompatible ideas, or this idea that we can't work with these people, or these people are lazy, or these people don't work hard enough, and these people aren't clever enough, just based on like racial stereotypes, prevents us working together. Let's say even local government, right? If you've got an idea that somewhere's a no-go zone, so you refuse to go in and talk to the people that live there, how are you going to fix their problems if you don't know what they are? Like, this is a real issue. If, like, for instance, do you think that the Conservatives come round Manchester and learn what people in Manchester's problems are?
No.
No, they don't, do they? Because they don't give a shit. Or they see them as like...
They not argue that people in Manchester don't vote Tory?
Yeah, well, it's a circle, isn't it? It's circular.
So they would say that it's not their job to represent the people of Manchester. It's the Member of Parliament from, I guess, the elected constituents to then represent them in Parliament. But I guess then your response might be, well, if the Conservatives wanted a better country, they would work with the Members of Parliament from even Labour to then...
Yeah, well, here's what I think, is that they don't know or care what the problems of actual working class people are. So they might say, well, we're not going to get your vote anyway. Well, they're not trying, are they? So they don't actually care what the problems are. So what do they do instead? They know that they have the vote of the rentiers. They know they have the vote of the people accumulating wealth. And whether that's even in those people's benefit is a question I think we should ask in another podcast. Should the ultra-wealthy want to hoard wealth? I don't think it's actually good for them either. But I think that's a question for another podcast. But what do they realise that they can win votes on if they're not going to win the working class, which is the biggest percentage of the vote? They win it on racism.
Well,
they
immigration,
win it,
isn't it?
So, yeah, not just immigration, though. Racism and issues that can segment audiences. Like Lee Anderson even said, we can use the trans debate as a wedge issue. He admitted it. Like, he basically said their tactic, use wedge issues to split the interests of groups. Trans issues are very related to women's rights and women's issues in general. But when women turn against trans women, all they do is they basically segment and divide a group that needs to work together. And this is the same with white workers that turn against workers of colour, is they segment and they break up their collective power. This is why LGBTQIA+ is such a big, wide-ranging group, because they all have shared interests. And the moment that they say, oh, it's just the gays, it's just the bisexuals, the moment they do that, their power is diminished and they are unable to achieve actual change. It's like Trump is a great example of divide and conquer. He knows that when places work together, they can be strong, but if you can break them apart and deal with them individually, you can win if you're bigger and stronger. But how do you defeat a bully? Normally you have to team up. And that's why in this situation, racism works to break people apart from one another. And seeing immigrants and the idea of illegal immigrants as the enemy, which is a very small percentage of migration anyway, all it does is it acts as a wedge issue through which to segment and break apart people who should be working together. And that's why I think Labour pursue this idea of, if we play into this wedge issue, if we play into it, perhaps we can prevent these segmentations. Perhaps we can unite the workers together and create a coalition. But all that happens is if you play into one form of segmentation, another arises. There's always going to be a culture war, in quotations, issue.
On that note, I think we've got to half an hour or more or less there, so probably call it for today. But maybe we'll build further on this for other podcasts. But yeah, that my brain is fried listening, so I can only imagine what the audience is like. So thank you for listening to this episode of the Northern Roses podcast. And again, if you would like to support this podcast or the Northern Rose in general, we would appreciate it if you subscribed to our email list and shared the podcast with your friends. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Yeah,